Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture on Latina feminism through Americanization. And this lecture focuses on chapter 3 of Ruiz and the Escobedo article. So the reading talks about the role of popular culture starting from the 1920s, American popular culture, and how it affected young Mexican American women coming of age during that time. And so they talk about how these women felt a sort of the tug of assimilating into American culture through consumer culture, wanting to fit into the fashion of the times, which was the flapper style, which we see depicted there in the image, and the use of makeup, as they are, of course, influenced by commercials and magazines and all of that kind of stuff. And so to bob your hair was a significant act in the 1920s, where prior to this period, a woman's long hair was one of the significant sides of her femininity. And so what we see here in the image is an example of that hairstyle in a collection of hairdresser magazines published in the 1920s. The reading talked about then how this also was upheld within the Mexican American community as well through the various beauty pageants that were sponsored by different community organizations. The rise of beauty salons was another feature of this demand for different hairstyles, and it also created an alternative source of good jobs for Mexican American women to have. There was also advertisements in Spanish language media which promoted Americanization through such ads as those about bleaching creams, hair coloring, which promised women better status and affection. And so what you see in this image is a group of Mexican American women flappers in 1925. The reading also talk about the chaperone system that existed, and some of you may be familiar with this system or have heard about it from women in your family. And so this is a system where young women are not allowed to go out on their own. They have to have a chaperone, whether that's a older sibling or an aunt or what have you. But the idea is that single women are not allowed to go out on their own because their virtue has to be watched over. And so the reading talks about how women of this generation navigated this particular system. And so some women just accepted the chaperone system and didn't question it. We saw a number of different examples being talked about in the reading through the interviews that the author made. Others figured out ways to work within the system by having a brother serve as a chaperone, and he would bring sort of a blind date for his sister, or they would go out with a group of other women. And then there were ways in which that women also resisted the system by either sneaking around, marrying early to get out of sort of the surveillance of their family members, or moving out on their own. Now, the chaperonage system wasn't perfect. Some girls did get pregnant and face different responses by family members. Some families rejected the pregnant daughter because they felt she dishonored the family. Pregnant daughters also became examples for the community of the dangers of failing to appropriately police her sexuality. There are also tensions between the different generations about different perceptions around the chaperonage system. But these tensions were also exacerbated when some of the young women were income earners in their families and contributed to the income of the family. And so these women felt that they deserved more autonomy and used the sort of leverage their position as income earners in the household to be able to have a little bit more independence and agency. The reading also talks about sort of the bigger context in which these women were navigating assimilation and acculturation. Mexican American adolescents felt the lure of Hollywood and at the same time the threat of deportation, the barbs of discrimination, and the reins of constant supervision. In dealing with all the contradictions in their lives, many young women focus their attention on chaperonage as an area where they can make decisions. So they couldn't do much about being segregated in public spaces, inequities in the workplace, discrimination in housing covenants. So the challenging the chaperonage system felt like something that they could do, that they could potentially have an influence on when everything else around them felt oppressive, essentially. Although the chaperonage system declined after World War II, the prescriptions surrounding the women's sexuality still remain, as seen in the poem by Bernice Zamora that is included in the chapter, where the young girl is the only one who is told to be ashamed of herself for having kissed a boy. No one says anything to the boy. We also see how one of the interviewees, who was threatened by her mother that she would be sent to a school for unwed mothers if she ever disgraced the family, used the same threat against her own daughter years later. So we see sort of the replication of aspects of the system with different generations. The article talks about the Pachuca style of the 1940s, and sort of we see again sort of another time period where clothing, hairstyles, these become ways in which young women navigate their sense of independence and agency, and also sort of not only challenge their traditional families, but they also challenge sort of mainstream American expectations as well. So the reading talked about the zoot style of clothing that existed during this time period, a style that became an expression of the Mexican-American generation, where they were kind of stuck between their traditional Mexican families and cultures and traditions and so on, and the mainstream American culture that they also didn't feel they fit in. So this becomes sort of their in-between space, right, where they create their own form of expression through their style of clothing. Now, because the war is going on at this time, this style becomes critiqued as unpatriotic, excessive, and begins to be seen as a sign of delinquency. Now, the reading also talked about the many ways in which, for young women, this became a style for them to show their resistance. It was a way of challenging ideas of respectability. They challenged the proper feminine decorum, as you see in this style. They're also, in a way, doing some interesting gender expressions, where some are purchasing their clothes from men's clothing stores or the men's section of a department store. So they're challenging what femininity is supposed to be and what that looks like. They also challenge Mexican traditional gendered expectations through their styles. It also becomes a style of expressing a form of liberated sexuality. And they also challenge white beauty standards, reappropriating mainstream cosmetics and using them in a very different kind of way. Right, the way the cosmetics are presented to advertisements have a very subdued kind of look. And when you look at the images of these women, they're using the cosmetics in a very bold kind of way. Now, the reading talked about how for young women, them expressing themselves in this way was perceived as a quote unquote problem. They were seen as symbolic of Mexican cultural pathology, that this was evidence of what was wrong with Mexican culture and why they needed to be assimilated. Many of these women, the reading talked about, were arrested and became wards of the state or sent to reform schools. And this also was seen as evidence of Mexican family parental failure, right? The reading talked about how mainstream media, for example, talked about these young women and their liberated sexuality and their ways in which they express themselves as evidence that the Mexican family that there was something wrong with it, that parents weren't doing their jobs properly. And so it provided a reason for intervention from the state to be able to say, well, they don't know how to raise their children, so we're going to have to take over. Their form of style and expression was also perceived as a threat in many ways, particularly from reformists of this era, whose goals were to Americanize minority populations, especially Mexican populations. So of course, them not expressing themselves in sort of traditional mainstream forms of femininity was perceived as a threat to Americanization. They also were perceived as a threat as in terms of racial mixture, because again, during this time period, many of these young people are interacting with each other at jazz clubs, at dance clubs. And so these young women were interacting with young white men, especially when they were home on leave from the military. And so reformists saw this as a threat of a potential racial mixture between the two. They also talked about these women as a threat because of their quote unquote militant racial consciousness. We saw examples of where reformists complained, especially when these young women were in some of those reform schools, about how they talk Spanish to each other, or defending themselves against white girls, calling them dirty Mexicans in high schools. And so their actual racial consciousness was also perceived as a threat and was tied to their particular Zusu style. Reform schools meant to turn these young women into quote unquote fine American girls and good citizens, right? So this clearly demonstrates an assumption that they aren't already fine American girls or good citizens. They also weren't accepted by their Mexican family or members of their community, right? Because they were perceived as a threat from that perspective as well, right? They perceived Pachucas as the negative influence of Americanization. They perceived them as threatening their Catholic traditions of family honor. We saw the example of the newspaper that called these young women Malinches. And we've talked about before what this term means and its suggestions of these young women being traitors to their race, traitors to their community for deciding to express themselves in the ways that they did. They also were often depicted as prostitutes and quote unquote being not particularly clean. So these young women were caught once again, right, between the pressures of American mainstream culture that was perceiving them and talking about them as delinquents and a bad influence and so on. And yet at the same time, many of their families and their community members were talking about them also in negative ways, right? So these young women were sort of caught in between these two pressures, while all they were trying to do was identify and develop a form of expression that best captured their particular experience as Mexican American young women coming of age in the 1940s during the wartime in the United States. So this ends the lecture for this week. I look forward to your thoughts and discussion in the discussion post. Have a wonderful week.